and this is important for the modern conflict, is in stark contrast to nearly every other nation in the Middle East. According to a Pew Research study from a few years ago, while 81% of Israel's population is ethnically Jewish, only about 40% identify as religiously Jewish. They're not a theocracy. It's not a nation even of predominantly religious Jews. It is a nation built on an ethnic heritage, but it functions as a modern, pluralistic state that by and large seeks to protect life and freedom. It protects other religions, even within its own nation. It protects religious freedom. This fact is, again, all the more striking when we look at all of the other nations in the Middle East. Most of the population that surrounds the nation of Israel is Islamic. And while the forms of government vary in the other nations in the region, Islam as a religion, unlike biblical Christianity, has strong theocratic tendencies and discourages or even prevents religious freedom. And that, of course, leads to the central cause of the current conflict. The de facto government of Palestine is Hamas, an Islamic resistance movement that defines itself in its charter as, quote, a distinguished Palestine movement whose allegiance is to Allah and whose way of life is Islam. It strives to raise the banner of Allah over every inch of Palestine. That's from their charter. In another place in the charter, Hamas declares, this is important, Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it, just as it obliterated others before it. Their charter further states the day of judgment will not come about until Muslims fight Jews and kill them. In other words, violence and death and the murder of particularly Jews is in the very charter of Hamas, who is the governing controller of the Palestinian government. So when you look at those two people groups and nation states, and at this point, Palestine has not been recognized by the world as a nation state, but let's even assume that it were. If you were to look at these two groups of people, the distinction could not be clearer. On the one hand, you have an imperfect, secular democracy that tries to protect its citizens. And on the other hand, you have a religious, theocratic terrorist organization whose charter is committed to violence, death, and in particular, annihilation of the Jews. So just on that basis, and if we understand God's institution of human government, the Christian conclusion ought to be clear. We need to protect and support and promote those nations that are protecting life as God intended, and we ought to oppose those nations or people groups whose stated purpose is genocide. But again, I want to stress something very important, and I'm speaking to those of you who do support Israel. This support cannot be unconditional. Again, it's not blind support. It's not based on a belief that Israel is prophetically special in this age. We don't support Israel uncritically or blindly. We support, I would advocate for the supporting of Israel only to the degree that the nation state of Israel is protecting innocent life, promoting justice, and punishing evil. If and when Israel as a nation state were to go outside of those God-ordained boundaries of what human government is intended to be, we ought to call it out. We ought to criticize it. We ought not to support actions stated by any nation state that contradict the moral purposes of God, protecting innocent life, rewarding justice, and punishing evil. And so I want to be clear about this. Although there absolutely exists today anti-Semitism, in which there are people who sinfully say that if you're a Jew, your ethnicity in and of itself makes you a bad person. There are people like that. We ought to oppose anti-Semitism. But let's be clear on this. It is not anti-Semitic to criticize particular policies or military decisions of the modern secular government of Israel. And I'm not even citing any right now. I'm not saying there are some we ought to criticism, not one way or the other. I'm going to leave those specifics to you. But we need to be careful because sometimes we see if somebody criticizes a particular policy decision that Israel makes, well, they're just anti-Semite. Well, not necessarily. They could be. If they tie evil to genetics, evil to ethnicity, that is anti-Semitism, that is racism. But it is not automatically anti-Semitic to criticize specific policy decisions or military decisions of the modern secular state of Israel. We can and should hold any leader of any nation, even Israel, accountable to principles of justice, just like we would any other government. And again, even if you believe that there is a future for national Israel, and even if you believe Israel is the people of God, even if you believe that the promise made to Abraham in Genesis 12:3 is in effect today, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. Even if you believe all of those things, you cannot uncritically support Israel, the modern state of Israel. Not everything that they do necessarily can automatically be considered good and biblical.